Okay, so let's talk about the Battle of New Orleans. This presentation is a little bit different. It's a little bit unique compared to a lot of talks that I give to groups and that kind of thing, or podcast episodes that we do. This one's a little bit unique in that it was to a very specific group of folks, which was the walking tour guide class for the Friends of the Cabildo back last month in March. Now, the Friends of the Cabildo, which I am a member and a volunteer tour guide, and took this class last year in 2025, the Friends of the Cabildo offer twice daily, rain or shine, French Quarter walking tours. Great tour, $30. I'll be doing it in a couple of weeks, I think. Will be my first one for this month. Um, but the idea here is uh, to become a Friends of the Cabildo walking tour guide, you have to take a 4 week class, a 4 week training class on how to be a tour guide. The first 2 weeks of which usually consist of a good bit of historical background. We bring in uh, uh, experts, professors, teachers, uh, subject matter experts on different topics involving in New Orleans history, New Orleans architecture, food. You get the idea. I was very privileged to present the talk to the class, the lecture to the class on the Battle of New Orleans. So, basically, they already covered French colonial history, Spanish colonial history, the Louisiana Purchase. Now we're up to 1815, and I've done a little bit on, or have a little bit of knowledge on the battle. So I was very, very honored and pleased that they had me in for that particular presentation. Who am I, of course? If you didn't know already, I am Edward Brandley, your NOLA history guy, at NOLA history guy on all the social medias. And there's my email if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, etc., etc. Now, as I said, this particular presentation is a bit condensed. I had an hour on the schedule to do this, and I stuck to that. I wasn't going to run overtime or anything. So this particular presentation is not it hits the high points that what I felt a tour guide in the French Quarter needed to know about the battle and some of the background and everything else. That glosses over a lot of stuff. And I know it's like there are going to be people who are better at the battle or well versed in the battle than I am that are going to listen to this, watch this, and say to themselves, yeah, you missed this, you missed that, that kind of thing. Just forgive me on that. It's going to take us like a series of podcasts to nail the battle completely as we go. But for tour guides, here's some of the talking points. You always hear that the Battle of New Orleans was the last battle of the War of 1812. I like to say that it's the last campaign of the War of 1812. The battle itself was on the 8th of January, but things continued past that time. The British didn't just up and quit and leave uh, after the defeat in Chalmette. So I say it's the last campaign of the War of 1812 would be more accurate. The goal here is that the British wanted control of the Mississippi River. If you've ever heard the term port of deposit, that was the Spanish theory behind what they saw the role of New Orleans being. That when the Spanish had control of New Orleans from 1762 to 1803, the idea was everything had to come through us, and so if we didn't like you, we didn't give you permission to come down the river with your cargo and then sell it to send it ocean across on ocean going ships, transfer and go from there. Uh, that was the goal. The British wanted that control. Of course, at this point, New Orleans is American territory, part of the United States in 1814, 1815. So it's an American port of deposit. British get control. That's a big deal. The campaign begins in the fall of 1814, ends in the spring of 1815. The battle is in January, but as I said, the campaign keeps going because the British don't completely give up on January 8th. There are three approaches to New Orleans. You can come up the river, you can come down Bayou St. John, or you can come over through Lake Borgne via the swamp and come up the river from what is now St. Bernard Parish. The British choose the swamp, and that's the battle. Basically, to get there, they have to clear out Lake Borgne, which is the Battle of Lake Borgne, or various attacks in Lake Borgne start on the 8th of December of 1814, run to the 14th of that year. Lake Borgne is cleared out. The British land and await Pakenham on the 22nd of December in 1814. Major General Sir Edward Pakenham had been appointed to command the North American force after the death of his predecessor in Baltimore. So, but he doesn't get. Obviously, he's got to come. He's got to come back from Great Britain at that point. So there's a bit of a delay. Jackson and the Americans see the British coming in. They see the British land. Jackson immediately says, "Let's go see what's going on." He launches a night attack on the night of the 23rd to the 24th of December. It's strictly kind of in his case a quick attack. He's not looking he has no idea the size of the force yet, so they kind of pull back. Pakenham arrives the next day on the 25th. Pakenham gets the lay of the situation, assesses everything, and he launches a reconnaissance in force back to Jackson's line on the 28th. After that reconnaissance in force, it's all about artillery. It's basically they're shooting at each other with cannon back and forth until Pakenham decides to advance on the American position on the 8th of January of 1815. January 8th, the glorious 8th of January, is a disaster for the British for a number of different reasons. Mostly their own errors and their own miscommunication doom the assault, and we'll break that down. The British retreat after 3.5 hours of combat on the morning of January the 8th. They retreat back, but Vice Admiral Cochrane still tries one more attack to come up the river on the 9th. And we'll wrap the talking about the city and the battle, because remember, we're talking to tour guides. So let's talk about the campaign. Now, the War of 1812, of course, has been going on now for 2.5 years at this point. The British control Canada, and the Royal Navy basically controls the Atlantic. So the disputes that the British have with the former 13 colonies, now expanded out into a larger United States of America, have been going on for enough. The Americans, of course, are allies with France, and the British have been at war almost continuously with France since the better part of a century at that point. But the big thing is since the beginning of the French Revolution, and now by 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte is emperor of the French, and they've been fighting the British now since he took over in 1799, like I say, again, they were fighting the French Republic, and then later the French Empire, as Napoleon declares himself emperor. That means there's not a lot of resources that the British can dedicate to shutting down any kind of attacks from the Americans. That's basically the idea, the issue at that point. That is until the summer of 1814, when Bonaparte is defeated and the British start rethinking the American war because now they can dedicate more resources to it. The ship you see, the tall ship you see there, is a British man of war. It's Her Majesty's ship Tonnant of 80 guns, which was Vice Admiral Cochrane's flagship from the Jamaica station that moves into the Gulf of Mexico, and Cochrane is in overall command of the campaign into the Gulf and to take New Orleans. So here's the British strategy for 1814. The strategy here, basically, again, the goal is to take New Orleans, thereby gaining control of the Mississippi River. Take New Orleans, you've got a foothold on the western side. The British, since 1812, have attacked down into the United States from Canada. You see Canada there in the red, and then the force up top moving into upstate New York. The theory there, or the goal there, is to attack down, try to take New York City, and then the Navy, the Royal Navy brings troops into Chesapeake Bay to attack Baltimore, and then Washington, D.C. They do invade D.C. and burn the city. The Americans are able to regroup and push back a good bit, though, on this as things go forward. That's when the British decide, let's see if we can do this, or take a different approach here. Because again, now they have the resources. They can dedicate more troops and ships into the Gulf of Mexico to capture New Orleans. So Cochrane gets reinforcements into the Jamaica station. You see the little pink dot down there, the pink island, that's Jamaica. Cochrane takes his force from the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico, and he's looking at three ports. He's looking at taking Pensacola, Mobile, Alabama, and of course, New Orleans, and moving in from there. So that's the strategy, and kind of a revised strategy as things go on. What does this gain the British if they pull it off? Control of the port of New Orleans and control of the Mississippi River. Now, as I said, the Spanish knew this was a big deal. And as a matter of fact, the Spanish used this to the Americans' advantage, going all the way back to 1777. Bernardo de Galvez in the Louisiana State Museum at the Cabildo, we have this really, really good. I'm a docent at the Cabildo, by the way, so I'm very pleased with how the Galvez exhibit came out and came about. Basically, because this is America 250, the bicentennial plus 50 years now for the United States. One of the a very important part of the revolution was the Spanish controlling New Orleans and able to send supplies up the Mississippi River, up through the western side of the basically of that territory into the 13 colonies, so that Spanish aid became a big deal. The British knew that, learned from that, and said, if we have New Orleans and we have the river, we will cut off the United States on the western side. They control the north in Canada, and they control the eastern side because of the Royal Navy, and could do a full-on blockade that they figured would compel the United States to basically come back to the United Kingdom. So all this hinges on capturing New Orleans and moving up the river. So Cochrane is working in conjunction with the Army, and they're discussing the various approaches to New Orleans. There's three basic approaches: come up the river, come down the bayou from Lake Pontchartrain, or come in from the swamp. Coming up and attacking from the river. Going upriver at this time is slow. Why? Because the current in the Mississippi River is that strong. So trying to get up the Mississippi River is quite the challenge. Now, by the time of steam power, the time we've got regular steamboats and steam ships coming up the river, getting from the mouth of the river, from say Southwest Pass up into the Mississippi and then up to New Orleans, is really a matter of hours at that point. But before that, using just wind power, it's a slow slog going up against the current. It requires tacks and changing course in the river to catch the wind to push you up. It's slow going, could take as much as 2 or 3 days. Well, that becomes a problem if those defending the river have guns pointing at you, down, looking, staring down at you into the river. And of course, that is exactly what the French and Spanish had constructed down in what is now Plaquemine Parish at Fort St. Philip. So the French and the French build Fort St. Philip, the Spanish reinforce it, the Americans take over with the Louisiana Purchase and continue that reinforcement. So any ships that come up the river have to get past Fort St. Philip. And they've got guns, they've got artillery. Not only do they have artillery, they've got a furnace there where they can heat up the cannonballs. So you've got red hot cannonballs, red hot shot, ready to be rained down on wooden ships that are nothing but wood and canvas sails. Not a good idea. So Cochrane decides, no, coming up the river. Also, the fact that the largest ship, like the Tonnant, is just way too heavy, and its draft is too deep to get up the river anyway. Possibility number two: come in from the western side of the Gulf of Mexico into Lake Borgne, go through Lake Borgne into either via the Rigolets Pass or Chef Menteur, and come into Lake Pontchartrain. Once you're in Lake Pontchartrain, the big connector, the first connector you get to, of course, is Bayou St. John. And Bayou St. John is exactly how the brothers Lemoyne actually got to New Orleans in the first place, is come down the bayou and then walk your way from what is now Mid-City in New Orleans via the Great Portage back down to the river, where Jackson Square is now. By 1812, actually by 1795, the whole thing is a water trip, because by the time you get to the end of the bayou, the Spanish had built a canal that is the Carondelet Canal, we call it, or the Old Basin Canal, from Basin Street and the turning basin there at the northern end of the French Quarter up to the end of the bayou in the marshy area that, well, I always like to say that the bayou came to an end and the Carondelet Canal connected to the bayou, pretty much where Parkway Bakery is right now, right there in right along Bayou St. John. The big problem with this one, same problem essentially as with the river and with Fort St. Philip, in that there's a fort with guns guarding the mouth of the bayou at its entrance on Lake Pontchartrain. The other complication here is even worse than the river, is that the ships the big ships, anything bigger than a schooner, probably even a schooner itself, the draft would be too deep. So there's no bringing the Tonnant, there's no bringing sloops of war through the Chef Menteur Pass into Lake Pontchartrain. So what would have to happen is you'd have to launch boats, small craft, vessels, rowboats, that kind of cutters, that kind of thing, into basically into Lake Borgne, go through the two passes, and then come down in boats, open boats down the bayou. Now, the British were real good at that kind of attack and that kind of approach, but there's this fort here with guns and, again, a furnace and heated shot and everything else, and you're not even attacking wooden ships with strong sides to withstand an attack. You're talking about open boats that are being rowed by sailors. So that becomes a problem, and basically, Spanish Fort, Old Fort St. John, kind of blocks the whole idea and shuts this down. That leaves the third approach, which is attack from the swamp, which means you come into the Gulf of Mexico and then decide we're going to come in from the Gulf of Mexico into Lake Borgne, sweep out any Americans that are there, and land on the western side of Lake Borgne in what is now St. Bernard Parish, and then advance from there onto the city via Chalmette. So the British choose the swamp because coming up the river, bad idea. There's a fort. Coming down the bayou, bad idea because we're using open boats. And there's another fort with artillery pieces ready to blow you out of the water. So the British choose the swamp. They come into Lake Borgne. The idea is we'll land troops on the western side of Lake Borgne and come in from there. That brings us to various moves and attacks into Lake Borgne that begin on the 8th of December and culminate on a full-on attack on the American presence in Lake Borgne on December 14th, 1814. The three big ships that come in, a sloop and two schooners, His Majesty's ships Seahorse, Armide, and Sophie, come into Lake Borgne, and they execute what is known as a cutting out expedition, or a cutting out by boats, that's led by Commander Nicholas Lockyer of the Royal Navy. If you're a hornblower aficionado or a O'Brien, rather Aubrey Maturin, uh, uh, Napoleonic Royal Navy fiction fan, in particular, cutting out expeditions, Forrester and Hornblower go through several of them. Really, really, if you're into this, that would be where you would want to look. So they lower boats from these three big ships, fill them up with sailors. They start rowing up to the gunboats, the one schooner and the one sloop. They overwhelm the very small U.S. force there that is commanded by Naval Lieutenant Thomas. I love this name, Thomas Ap Catesby Jones. God, what a great name. Lieutenant Catesby Jones is, of course, a naval officer. They get overwhelmed. He pulls back. They sink the bigger vessels to not add any more firepower to what the British already have. Now, remember, you can't get the Armide, Sophie, and Seahorse into Lake Pontchartrain. They know that. So they're going to just basically recall all the boats, load up the army troops and that have come over with those ships basically into boats, and deliver them to the western side of Lake Borgne. The British do just that on the 22nd of December in 1814. Now remember, there's a delay here. The Royal Navy sweeps out Lake Borgne on the 14th, but you've got to shuttle in. The British are looking to bring in 10,000 troops to attack New Orleans. That's going to require some shuttling in because you can't just bring the tonnage into Lake Borgne. So takes a little bit to get this settled. So by the 22nd of December, the boats are able to bring the land force up to the western side of Lake Borgne, where they land where Bayou Bienvenue meets Lake Borgne on the western side. The troops come in. They come down the bayou as much as they can, combination of marching as well as many boats as the Royal Navy can bring. They come down Bayou Bienvenue. Bayou Bienvenue, of course, you see curves off there and goes further west. But then Bayou Mozant comes down south, a more direct approach. So they take that route, and that ties to a canal that was constructed by the Villeray family for their plantation. So Bayou Mozant becomes the Villeray Canal. That's that last little kind of straight part that you see of that red path that comes in. So they come down the canal, they disembark from the boats, they wait, form up everybody, and they capture the Villeray plantation. And the stories of Major Villeray being awakened in the middle of the night and having to jump out of the second floor window of the family estate to get back up the river to warn Jack so that Villeray could warn Jackson. All true, all accurate. So the British land, and they are now by the 22nd of December at the Villeray plantation, and they're setting up camp and getting ready to proceed from there. That's where the battle truly begins. And the opening land attacks of the battle happen the next day on December 23rd. So the British move in at the Villeray plantation, and they set up Major General Keane and Major General Gibbs set up their command at the Villeray plantation. Remember, the overall command is Pakenham, but he's not there yet. So they set up, and then the British Army moves forward, basically moves toward the west, one plantation, if you will, to the Lacoste plantation, where they set up pickets and a defensive position with some artillery above the Villeray command post and go from there. Jackson has scouts. They're seeing what they're doing. So on the 23rd, Jackson says, let's go see what they've got. He brings a force down then from Chalmette further down to heading toward the Villeray plantation. He attacks the British positions at the Lacoste plantation. It's a night attack on the night of the 23rd going into the morning of the 24th. Now remember, Lacoste plantation just upriver from the Villeray plantation. A number of descriptions of what Jackson's attack, the approach he took, is what was referred to as an Indian style attack. And this is a common, complaint or description of from, in particular, British historians or folks writing about things from a British perspective. And this goes back to the whole idea of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian Wars, and other conflicts between Americans and the French and the Americans against the British earlier on, from in the late 1700s, is this idea that you're not fighting a traditional European pitched battle with two lines where you march toward each other and attack, that it's very much a guerrilla campaign at that point. And Jackson knew how that worked because he had been fighting the indigenous all the way from Mobile, pushing the British back out of Mobile, out of Pensacola, but of course also having to deal with the indigenous as well. But he's learning style, and his people are learning how to do that. Because it's a night attack, and because it's a very unconventional attack from the British perspective, Keane and Gibbs are led to believe that the American force is larger than it is. Had they moved forward at this point, they could have caught Jackson flat-footed. But there's a couple of problems there. One, they really thought that the Americans were bigger, and that I'm not taking the rap for this one. My boss, Pakenham, is not here yet. Let's pull back. Let's keep our line the way it is. Jackson saw what he was up against and said, okay, I need to come back, because now he knows they're bigger than what he's got defending New Orleans. So he pulls back, and the British don't capitalize. They don't take advantage of this at the time. So Jackson withdraws further back from, basically he moves out to the Lacoste plantation, but he pulls back to the McCarty plantation and the Rodriguez Canal, which is on the eastern side of the McCarty plantation. So he sets up there at the McCarty house, basically becomes Jackson's headquarters. There's a canal there. If you go out to the battlefield to this day, the Rodriguez Canal isn't a canal like in the sense of like the old Carondelet Canal or the New Basin Canal or even some of the outfall canals, like the London Avenue Canal or the Orleans Canal that we have in the city. It's kind of a ditch, but it is a big dip. It's kind of steep and it's a bit deep. It doesn't have a lot of water in it depending on drought, rainfall, and everything else, but it is a good place to get behind and use that as a defensive position. So Jackson goes to the western side of the Rodriguez Canal and he sets up a rampart running there from the river back into the forest and the cypress swamp all the way up. And that becomes the battle line. This is a graphic of the positions, and of course, all those red arrows are the attack. We'll get to that. I like this graphic, though. It's Dan Swenson, who goes by NOLA Graphics Guy. He worked for the paper for a good long time, and of course, did this drawing to better illustrate the positions, and it really does show how Line Jackson forms at that point. The only thing here that I kind of chuckle at, of course, is that there's two things of note here. Where first off, you see the cannon on the bottom of the illustration, which on the west bank of the Mississippi, and that was an American artillery battery that was set up by Jackson. They brought guns over to the west bank and set that up to attack the British on from the West Bank as they would move forward onto the American positions on the East Bank. That's quite accurate. The boat that's there, the ship that's there, that's a little bit inaccurate. There was the USS Carolina we'll get to in a moment, but it wasn't a river boat. And they can see the steamboat with the smokestacks, but well, Swenson gets a pass because everything else on here is really, really done well. So, 23rd, 24th of December, Jackson pulls back. He sets up, they start building the rampart on the western side of the Rodriguez Canal. Jackson says, this is where we're going to make our stand. Win, lose, or draw, we're going to stop them here, or hopefully stop them here. Christmas Day, 1814. The commander of the British force arrives in theater, as they say. Major General the Honorable Sir Edward Pakenham. GCB is Grand Cross Bath. He was a Knight of the Order of the Bath, which is the big military order that if you were, if you were a British officer of distinction, you'd receive a knighthood, and it usually would be in the Order of the Bath. He received the highest level of that, which was the the Grand Cross level. Pakenham was a brigadier and a major general in the Duke of Wellington's Peninsular Army that pushed up from Portugal into Spain, into the south of France, and that was the squeeze with the Prussians on the Prussians on the eastern side of France that compelled Bonaparte's surrender in 1814. After peace is being worked out in Versailles and negotiations with the Allies, this idea of being able of coming up with a plan to do something to exploit or use these additional resources in North America, the British government, the army offers the command in North America to the Duke of Wellington. Now he's kind of Arthur, first Duke of Wellington, is getting a little older. He's kind of tired. Says, "No, man, no, thank you. I'm not going over to North America. How about you take my brother-in-law, who is a major general? He's done very well for me in the war against Bonaparte. So they name Pakenham to be the new commander of the British forces in North America. Keane decided, of course, as we talked about, that they were going to hold everything up until Pakenham got there. So basically, they defended the position at the Lacoste plantation after, for Jackson's night attack, but they did not exploit what would have been a significant advantage because they wanted to make sure they wanted to wait for Pakenham. Now, why would you do that when you have basically when you have a hell of an advantage? It's because Pakenham was quite influential. He's the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, who he became a duke because he defeated Bonaparte. Now this is just before Waterloo, so he's not immortal yet, but he's still pretty influential. Had this whole plan worked out, though, Major General Pakenham would have become the overall commander of North American forces. And had they been able to compel the capitulation of the United States and bring the expanded 13 colonies back into the British Empire, then he very well could have commanded, he could have governed all of that almost as a viceroy in North America. He was not a man to be trifled with in that respect. So, in particular, Keane said, no, we're going to wait. I'm not crossing this guy. That's bad for my career. So they hold up, and then basically the one big opportunity goes right past them. Remember, I was talking about Swenson's diagram with that steamboat. There really was a ship. There was a schooner from a United States naval vessel that did come down from New Orleans into the area around or not far from the Lacoste and Villeray plantations. It was the USS Carolina. It was commissioned in June of 1813. It was named the Carolina, not the North Carolina or the South Carolina, but just Carolina. It was the only ship in the Navy that doesn't separate in that respect. This is a painting of the Carolina off of the off of the city of Charleston up on the Atlantic coast, and that's what the vessel looked like. So it had 10 guns. They brought it down from the port of New Orleans and positioned it there by the Villeray plantation. This vessel, this ship, and its crew were a big deal. They were experienced up and down the river. As a matter of fact, they destroyed Lafitte's stronghold in Barataria in an attack in September of 1814, which made it real iffy as to whether or not Lafitte was gonna help out Jackson. But that we'll get to that part of the story in a minute. So the Carolina is bombarding the British positions between Lacoste and Villeray plantations all the way up to the 28th. Now, of course, Pakenham gets there on the 25th. He takes one look at this situation. He says, "Oh hell no!" So he approves bringing up artillery to the river, to basically to the riverbank, sets up a furnace. They start firing heated shot at the Carolina, and they sink the vessel on the 28th of December. That gives Pakenham a little bit more breathing room to assess what he's got, come up with a plan, and talk to his generals and move forward. On the 28th, he shuts down the attack from the river, and he decides, let's engage in a reconnaissance in force. We're not sure what Jackson's got up there. Let's send troops up. He sends up not his entire force, but does what is known in military terms as a reconnaissance in force. And that reconnaissance brings up artillery pieces, and they start an attack on what is the center of Line Jackson, the center of the defense at the Rodriguez Canal. That attack was quite successful, and the British almost break through. But remember, Pakenham thinks that Jackson has a much larger reserve than he did, and the reconnaissance did not basically didn't put the lie to that. He could not definitely confirm that basically what was on the rampart was pretty much all Jackson had. Had he done that, had he gone through, the British could have broken through, and this truly was the closest that the British came to defeating the Americans and pushing Jackson back. What would have happened from there? Who knows? Because now the Americans would have been on the run, trying to regroup to stop to prevent the British from getting to the city. But of course, Pakenham made that decision to withdraw, saying, okay, we see what we've got. We see this line. Now we'll plan a full attack from there. That full attack, of course, is all about the artillery. We talk about artillery, of course. In 1815, artillery was shooting cannonballs at your enemy. But by 1815, that approach, or artillery approach, had become a little bit more sophisticated as well. More than just cannonballs, but the goal here from artillery basically was twofold. One was to suppress the enemy's guns, so you bring your guns forward to try to take out these batteries that are at the rampart that the Americans had set up. And then also to then, once you suppress their artillery fire, you can bring your guns closer and to break any defensive lines that your enemy have and advance on their position. Guns, though, are hard to move, and you can kind of see how this works on this photo. Now, this is actually a photo from the battlefield, from Chalmette National Battlefield, and you can see the blue field pieces, the blue artillery pieces that are there are field artillery guns that would be brought up by army troops, either with mules, horses, oxen. It's slow going, though. These guns are incredibly heavy and they're hard to move. And remember, if you've ever been down to Chalmette, we're talking swampy ground up in this area, not talking about really solid, bedrock and everything else. That gun on the right in the foreground of that photo is even more of a challenge. That's a naval gun that comes off of one of the vessels. There were several guns that were taken off the Carolina in particular and set up in the rampart. And the guns similar to that naval gun were there on Line Jackson and used to defend the position. The British had a number of these naval pieces as well. And you can see, look at those wheels. That's not good for moving across the ground. Usually the way you moved a naval gun was you hoisted the gun out of its carriage, you put it on canvas, or you put it on on cloth or basically like sailcloth, and then you pulled it with men, because of course you didn't want to wear out your beasts of burden on this, because it would just run them to exhaustion. So literally you'd have sailors, you'd have soldiers pulling the gun and then coming back with that gun carriage so you can set it up and rebuild it again. Not a good situation and not a good advantage. So it was very difficult for the British to advance and move forward. The Americans, though, sitting behind the line, they were easy to sight the guns and then, of course, defend the positions. We think of those big cannon, we think of artillery fire, and usually we think of classic cannonballs, 9-pound, 12-pound. There was even a 30-pound gun that was on the Carolina that was set up in the line until it overheated and became disabled. But in addition to classic cannonballs, there were two other kinds of shot that were used at the time that were very, very effective on the glorious 8th of January: chain shot and grape shot. The top picture there, you can see the chain. That's why it was called chain shot. You took, like in this case, say a 9-pounder cannonball, hollowed it out, but then you mounted a chain inside. You scoop all of that, put it back in the hollowed out cannonball, and then loaded that into the gun. You fired the gun, the ball would immediately separate. It wasn't sealed or anything. So the two halves of the cannonball pop open, and that chain goes flying at your enemy. Now, if you're on a ship of war and you're fighting, you're in a naval battle, that's really a great thing because you're going to aim that at masts and sails, and those chains are flying at the canvas sails, disabling your enemy. On the ground, you fire those at troops, and that is a bad thing for anybody getting within range of it. Grape shot, same kind of idea. Think shotgun shell. Think of a 12 gauge shotgun shell. What's inside of a shotgun shell? Pellets. You're using it, a lot of times to shoot birds, right? So you don't want to shoot a big old bullet or that kind of thing at birds because you blow the bird away. You want to hit them with those pellets so that you bring the bird down, but you can still eat it after after you retrieve them. Grape shot's the same concept, but now the pellets are big. We're talking big round balls that look the size of grapes or even bigger, hence grape shot, just bigger. So you put those in a canister, you wrap them in paper, surround it with some string. That's the size of the bore of the gun. You put that into the gun. When you fire the gun, that shoots out of the barrel. It's all paper. The flame, the heat from the flames from firing the gun basically burns that off, and it's like shooting a shotgun, but it's basically the size of grapes at that point. That's anti-personnel. Again, used in ships. The idea would be to hit the sails and damage the ship. Here, grape shot was used, and of course, Jackson. One of the big complaints that the British had about Jackson, well, he didn't fight fair. What did he do? He took that chain shot, took that grape shot, and he ordered his gunners, his artillerymen, fire at horses. Fire at if you see a British soldier on a horse, that's an officer. Fire the grape shot at him. Take him out. You break up their command and control. You get the idea. One more thing on artillery, because, well, the line is in the song, of course, and that is Congreve's rockets. Congreve, British artilleryman, invents rockets. Have been around now for quite some time, right? It's like the idea of what we now have is New Year's Eve and 4th of July fireworks of bottle rockets and skyrockets. The British Army and the Royal Artillery weaponized that style and developed a rocket force. And you can see that looks like a giant bottle rocket, or basically, bigger skyrocket. You still couldn't put a big payload on it, but that thing coming down on fire onto a troop position could cause a lot of grief. At the Battle of New Orleans, well, of course, take a step back, these rockets were quite effective. Again, anti-personnel weapons firing at ships in particular. And the rocket's red glare, you get the idea, bombs bursting in air. The Royal Horse Artillery had a rocket troop with them, a Congreve rocket troop that came down with Cochrane's forces. 40 artillerymen and 500 rockets. They were set up to be part of Pakenham's force. The main role that they were to have on that day was to be for signaling, and in particular because one of the components of the British plan was to come and take out that battery on the West Bank, was that some of the rocket troop went along with the force on the West Bank to signal to Pakenham when the guns on the West Bank had been captured they could fire the rockets, and that would be used like basically setting up a flare and setting up a signal. All these guns now, the Americans are in place. They have their strategy. The British are advancing their guns as much as possible. Starting on January 1st, there's a ton of artillery back and forth to the point where the advance of the guns and the guns itself, the British guns, were in short supply in the first place, but the constant artillery duels taking place between January 1st and January 8th of 1815 created a major problem for the British, that by the time of the actual battle, Pakenham and his forces were down to only about 10 artillery pieces. And so they were very much not mismatched, but they were not in a position to overwhelm the American positions with counter battery fire. So it's the 8th of January, and the British are prepared. Pakenham is ready to advance against Line Jackson. So here is what Line Jackson looks like at this point. This is from a map from the Army map from a series of projects, basically a series of excursions, I guess is the best way to say it, that come out of the various research facilities at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. They're called scout rides, and there's a whole document put together to do an Army scout ride to come and retrace what happened at the Battle of New Orleans as part of military history. So this is a blow up of the scout rides positions on the morning of January 8th, 1815. So here's Line Jackson. You see that blue line going across the diagram there? That's the Rodriguez Canal. Again, a bit deceptive. It wasn't very deep, but it was a heck of a ditch, and you go from there. So you've got artillery closer to the riverbank on the left-hand side, as well as the 7th U.S. Infantry Battalion there close to the river. Jackson's headquarters, of course, is at the McCarty House right behind that. After the 7th Infantry, you get artillery, and then that LA militia, which is all of the New Orleanians who are defending the city at that point. And that is commanded by now General Villeray, basically coming from there. You've got Villeray with his militia troops, units of free people of color, as well as Creoles. We got Creoles under Villeray, free people of color under his overall command as well. Then the pirates themselves, and that's where you see batteries 5 and 6. That's Lafitte's gunners there. Then you get the Kentucky Volunteers, who had very recently, they'd only gotten there, I think, like on January 5th. They were kind of in bad shape. You know, the whole Battle of New Orleans song and the Kentucky Riflemen and everything. They were in pretty rough shape and undersupplied. They weren't the strong force, but they did do their part. And having the pirate gunners, having those naval gunners next to them, actually, you know, that contributed to them giving a very good account of themselves. So you've got Generals Carroll and Adair coming, actually, General Carroll, Colonel Adair coming with the Kentucky Volunteers then in the middle of Line Jackson, and then General Coffee and the Tennessee forces coming down, that had come down. This is the Army forces that had come with Jackson from Tennessee down to Mobile, and then marched over from Mobile to New Orleans. And then, of course, on the far end, we get indigenous Choctaw, for the most part, Choctaw tribesmen, some Chickasaw, but mostly Choctaw indigenous there on the swamp side. And of course, they're fighting, quote unquote, Indian style, which was very, very useful. They were basically in the role of light infantry in Europe, and there was a unit from the 95th Rifles that were attacking kind of in the rifle light infantry and rifles were designed to function much more independent of the main commands of a European power, European attack force, and having the indigenous over there was a great counter to that. So that's their position. That's the beginning of that's the prep for the battle on the morning in the fog, cold funk of dawn on January 8th. Now, we mentioned that the pirate gunners, Lafitte's gunners, were there at positions five, at battery 5 and battery 6, basically in between the militia and city defense forces and the Kentucky forces that had come down. Those artillery positions were manned by gunners, artillerymen from Jean Lafitte's squadron of, well, pirate ships, best way to describe it. Lafitte had just been given a beatdown by the United States Navy, and Commander Patterson of the Navy didn't do Jackson any favors at that point. But Jackson was now in control, and at some point before the battle, the two of them agree to meet. Jackson meets with Lafitte. He says, okay, I know we've got, we've got some bad blood here, that kind of thing. So what are we going to do about it? I'll give you pardons. I'll give you license to continue to function as privateers against the British. Just become part of the American force, and all is forgiven, and we'll work out all the smuggling and everything else as we go along. Lafitte agrees to this and commits forces. His forces are initially deployed out at Fort St. John on Lake Pontchartrain. And that's a big deal because, again, that was, remember, three possibilities of where the British could come in. And so a strong defense on the bayou was incredibly important. Once it became clear that the British were not coming from Lake Pontchartrain, then Jackson pulls the pirate gunners from Fort St. John, from Lake Pontchartrain. To this day, the reenactors on the 8th of January, the Battle of New Orleans, they stage a 5K run that symbolizes Lafitte's gunners leaving the Fort St. John and coming down to Chalmette. Now, of course, Lafitte was not present at the battle, and you get all the fanciful paintings and descriptions, but Jean Lafitte was not at the battle on the 8th of January. The overall coordinated command of his forces, his gunners, was entrusted to Dominique You, and you'll see it spelled either Y-O-U or Y-O-U-X. Dominique You is now considered to be the third Lafitte brother. You had Jean, who was the pirate, if you will, the naval coordinator, naval commander of those forces, privateer/pirate forces. His brother Pierre, who lived in the city and was the factor. Basically, he handled fencing the goods and the smuggling and everything else on the city side of things. And then Dominique was one of the captains of one of Lafitte's ships. And it's fairly certain now that Dominique You was the third Lafitte brother, but he kept the name separate for various reasons. He's the lead pirate at the battle. That becomes a big deal because he dines out on that basically for the rest of his life. So that in the 1830s, Dominique You actually runs for and becomes mayor of the city of New Orleans because he did indeed get pardoned and became quite the hero after the battle. So on to the glorious 8th of January, 1815. It's foggy, it's cold, it's misty, it's damp. But Pakenham decides this is the day we are going to go forward. So Line Jackson, we laid out for you there. You see that this is that scout ride uh, um, uh, map that lays everything out. So you can see Line Jackson at the top on the West Bank side of the Mississippi. You see the American artillery battery that was set up over there that was designed to protect the flank of Line Jackson on the river side. The theory being that if we had forces, if we had guns that could basically shoot across the river and help take out any kind of counter battery fire, as well as any direct advance on the riverbank, that would be an asset that would help change the direction of the British attack. On the riverbank itself, you see you've got artillery positions, then you've got a battalion of 1st West Indies Infantry, and then a battalion of the 93rd Regiment of Foot, the Sutherland Highlanders, all under the overall command there of Major General Keane. On the right-hand side, you've got Major General Gibbs, and the lead unit was supposed to be the 44th Foot, followed by the 21st, a battalion of the 21st Regiment of Foot, followed by the King's Own, the 4th Regiment of Foot. And that was under Major General Gibbs. In the rear, you've got battalion of the 7th Foot, additional West Indies and other troops in the reserve under General Lambert's command, with Pakenham in overall command. So this is beginning at just before dawn, with again increased artillery fire, and then these troops moving forward under the cover of artillery fire there in the center. There you see where the West Indies troops are, and you'll see those are British artillery positions. And again, the idea is suppression fire, counter battery fire to allow the British to move forward. This starts just before dawn, and then the full advance begins at basically just after 7, between 7 and 7:30, after the fog starts lifting because the sun is up. Notable regiments on the British side. The 44th East Essex Regiment of Foot was supposed to be that battalion was going to be Gibbs's lead unit on the right-hand side. Why were they in the lead? Because they were going to be carrying ladders and nets that would be used to get the British infantry across the Rodriguez Canal. Because remember, you've got a problem here. You've got all these Americans behind a rampart, behind a canal. And even if that canal's a ditch, it's kind of deep, it's a little bit rough. And if you go down into it, you've got guys shooting at you with muskets and cannon with grape shot that are pointing down into the canal to blow you away. So the plan was for the British 44th to pick up engineering supplies during the advance and then come with ladders and with what we call fascines, or big nets, like boarding nets that you'd use on ships. Throw that across the canal, throw the ladder so you could come down and then climb up the ladder as quickly as possible on the other side. Here's where the miscommunication and grievous errors on the British side happen. The 44th forgot the ladders. So what happens is the 44th have to come back And that means that instead of the 44th in the lead, things slow down. They have to turn around to go back to the engineering positions where all of these supplies were set up to be picked up to retrieve them. That means that the 21st and the 4th Infantry move forward past the 44th. Pakenham is pissed, and he decides he is going to then. It's like, this guy in command of the 44th is no use to me. Pakenham himself moves forward from the supply position to the Rodriguez Canal. That was a very costly, that decision to lead the troops himself cost Pakenham his life, because instead of staying in the back with Lambert and the reserve and coordinating the overall battle, he now became part of the detail. He became, instead of looking at the forest, he was in the trees, as it were. He gets too close. Grape shot takes him off his horse. He's mortally wounded and dies on the battlefield. That presents a major command and control problem that we'll look at in a minute. Other notable regiments at the battle. The most notable, of course, is the 93rd Regiment of Foot, the Sutherland Highlanders. The Sutherland Highlanders, the 93rd, were obviously a Scottish regiment, and there was a battalion of the 93rd that came from Jamaica, with basically from the peninsula to Jamaica up into the battle. One of the things you'll see in a number of depictions of the battle are the attack of the 93rd uh, onto Line Jackson. And you'll see that a number of these fanciful paintings, or more ornate, elaborate battle paintings, depict the 93rd wearing kilts. Now, it looks good. And a lot of those paintings were done after the Battle of Waterloo in June of 1815, which took place, of course, in Belgium. And so the artists would then started assuming that the 93rd wore kilts at New Orleans. They didn't. There's a big reason for that. It was January. It was freezing. We all know we all know the wardrobe choice of a Scotsman wearing a kilt. And literally, it was too cold for that nonsense. So they wore those tartan trews that you see over on the soldier on the left-hand side of that illustration. He's wearing those plaid tartan pants. The officers wore standard infantry officer trousers, and you can see the drummer as well. Interesting side bit about the British Army, and you can see this very, very well. I'll throw in a plug for the Galvez exhibit at the Cabildo, because the uniforms are there and the flags are there. You'll see that the 93rd, as well as the 44th, they wear red coats, because everybody knew that. The sixth graders that are coming, we say, so what were the color of the British Army uniforms? And everybody knows red coats. But there's a little bit of subtlety to that. You'll see that the collar, the officer's jacket, and even the cuffs and the drums of the drum of the drummer are all in yellow, and that was an identifier for the 93rd Foot. Their flag, their regimental color, also would have had a yellow background. So that was how you could tell where that particular force was. If you're sitting there with a telescope and you're like, say, one of a general's aide or something, and reporting back positions. So no, they didn't wear kilts. They were supposed to come up along the river, but that battery did not get disabled. So that basically they knew that if they had come up the river, they were going to come under attack from those guns. So they pivoted a little bit on the way, and that's part of the story coming up. The other notable regiment, of course, is the 4th Regiment of Foot, known as the King's Own, from Lancaster in Great Britain. and very, very distinguished, noble regiment of the British Army. You'll see the difference here. Let me flip back. You see the yellow on the Highlanders uniform. You'll notice that all the facings, the cuffs, the collars of the 4th of the King's Own, because they were a royal regiment, they had that distinction. Their collars, their opposite color is blue. They were supposed to be in the reserves. They had to be brought forward to they had to be brought forward to because the 44th had pulled back and the other regiments were taking casualties. The West Bank breakdown. Here's the problem. The British knew there was an artillery battery. The reconnaissance and force revealed that the British knew that the Americans had guns on the West Bank. They sent Colonel Thornton and a force coming up on the West Bank, moving up on that side. So basically, what Pakenham ordered was put some of our men in boats, row them across the river, and then set up on that side and advance from there. The problem was that Thornton was caught in an incredible amount of fog. It was much slower getting across the river. And once they got across the river, the advance was incredibly slow. The overall advance on the West Bank was 2 hours delayed. And that becomes the breakdown in the whole thing because they were so far behind. Keane had brought the West Indies troops and also was bringing forward the 93rd, but they were expected to go straight west from, or moving up the river. They were supposed to come straight at the west, the river side of Line Jackson, but they couldn't. And the reason they couldn't was because those guns were still in position on the West Bank side. So Keane orders the 93rd and the West Indies troops to pivot. Now, when you're marching in formation, you're presenting a small front to the enemy. But as soon as Keane told them to pivot and join in the center to fight in the center to get away from those guns, he exposed both units, and in particular the 93rd, to an incredible amount of fire. And that's when the guns, basically the batteries, Battery 5 and Battery 6, the Lafitte's gunners, just start massacring the troops. So the 24th are getting hit hard by the Tennesseans and by the Kentucky troops. The West Indies troops are getting hit by the city militia and Villeroy's command, and then the Highlanders are just getting cut down like nobody's business. Their command and control is completely disabled at this point. Pakenham is dead as the 44th come up. Gibbs is mortally wounded and dies. Keane is almost dies. He survives the battle, but he's still incapable of moving forward. Everything is just at a standstill. The 93rd in particular get very, very close to the Rodriguez Canal. They don't have orders to, they can't advance. They're getting massacred, but they don't have orders to retreat, and that becomes a problem. And that's when the retreat begins. Lambert is now in reserve. He has moved up from the Villeroy reserves up further past the Lacoste plantation, almost to the artillery battery. He's bringing up the reserves, but as he's bringing up the reserves, he is seeing in particular, the 93rd and the 4th King's Own being massacred by the center of Line Jackson. He orders them to retreat. By now, Pakenham is dead. Lambert got both Keane and Gibbs are out of everything. The three top commanders are gone. Lambert orders a retreat. He figures he is not going to be criticized for this because he is coming from the rear and he's seeing this mess. He figures he can pin it all on Pakenham, who is now laying dead on the battlefield. So he orders all of the units to withdraw. They withdraw back to the Villeray plantation. They stay there. Jackson does not advance. He's no fool. He knows he's well outnumbered, even though he's inflicted over 2,000 casualties on the morning of the 8th. He isn't going to press his luck. His job is done, that he's protected, he's defended the city, and he can see that they're withdrawing. Lambert then opens negotiations on, a flag of truce and everything to get the wounded, so they can withdraw, get their wounded and withdraw from the battlefield and basically come back out the way they came in. Cochrane is still out on the Tonnant. Messengers get back up to Lake Bourne, to the ships in Lake Bourne, back out to Cochrane. They know this is a disaster at this point. Cochrane says, well, we're going to try one more thing. Pakenham's dead. I'm still in overall command. I got to go back and face his brother-in-law, who is a lot more influential than I am. Let me see if we can make this work. So Cochrane tries to come up the river anyway. He brings a couple of sloops and the schooners. He brings bomb vessels, actually mortar vessels, basically a brig of a small vessel with a light draft with one of those big mortars of the time that you could then put basically a shell with a fuse and try to bomb the fort from a distance. It was not successful. He only had two of them. He can't get close to the fort because if he tries to bring those vessels in any closer, they're going to get taken out by the guns of the fort. So the attack fails. He withdraws the force. They regroup in the Gulf. They try one more thing, and that was to come into Mobile Bay and see if they could capture Mobile. That fails as well. So the force has to retire back to Jamaica. So the glorious 8th of January becomes a big deal in the history books. It gets to the point where, at this point, there's only one government holiday for the United States. And of course, that was Independence Day, the 4th of July. Going up into the 1820s, the city celebrates the glorious 8th of January as a holiday. And by the time Jackson is running for president, there's actually a push in Congress to make the 8th of January what would have been our second federal holiday. It doesn't go through, but boy, it's still quite the big. They were we sleep on the whole Battle of New Orleans now in terms of its importance, but they were well aware that the defense of New Orleans was a big deal. So in the city, of course, battles don't happen as a rule in a city. Battles happen outside of a city. Waterloo in Belgium was south of Brussels as Napoleon was trying to advance. They stopped him before he got to the big city. Anytime anybody attacked, whether it was the Germans attacking Paris, Paris would surrender after their armies were defeated in various wars and battles. They would declare the city open because they didn't want it blown away, that kind of thing. So that was the idea, was that anybody that was in the city, they weren't going to have this big pitched defense of the city if they didn't have to. Fortunately, it worked out that didn't matter. If you're touring the French Quarter, you're going to hear some stories about the battle. Our walking tour guides a lot of times will take you past Old Maspero's, what's now called original Pierre Maspero's, which was Maspero's Coffee House, which was a commercial factor. Pierre Maspero was a shipping factor and commercial broker. He actually owned the what's now Maspero's at the corner of Charters and St. Louis. For those of you familiar with the corner, Napoleon House is out of frame to the left in that top photo. That's from the basically that's a photo from 1939 of the building. That's one of the places that makes the claim of being the meeting place between Jackson and Lafitte to negotiate Jackson assisting, or rather Lafitte assisting Jackson in the defense of the city. The other place making that claim, of course, is the old Absinthe House on Bourbon Street. I don't buy either one, even though both of them make some compelling arguments for their claim. I don't buy either one because both of them are way too far into the city for Lafitte, who is an outlaw at that time, to come in. What's more likely is that Jackson and Lafitte were both Freemasons. So it's more likely that Jackson and Lafitte met on the level, on the square, as Masons at a Masonic lodge. And that most likely would have been Étoile Polaire, Polar Star Lodge, which is out at the on 1433 North Rampart Street. It's basically North Rampart and Kellerec Street, not far off of Esplanade Avenue. This building, this is the current lodge building that still stands, was built in the 1840s, but there was a lodge building there in 1814, 1815. It would have been easy for Jackson to get there. It would have been well known. Basically, the Masons of Étoile Polaire would have been very familiar with Jackson and his people. So that's the more logical place for my money as to the where the meeting would have taken place. If you're on one of our tours, of course, our being Friends of the Cabildo, there's a real good chance we're going to walk you down to Ursuline and Charter Streets, and you will see the old Ursuline Convent, which is still there, was built in 1754. So naturally, it was there in 1814 and 1815. The Ursuline nuns were there at the time, held vigil, and prayed to Our Lady of Prompt Succor to deliver the city from the foes of the evil Protestant British. Jackson, after the battle, came over to the convent, and this is the building that he would have seen. This is a detail in the remark in the borders of a survey map drawn in 1815. You want to see a big blow up of it? Come up to the Cabildo now in the second floor of our Marquis de Lafayette exhibit, and it'll show you what that it was big blow up of that survey map that's up on the wall there in Arsenal 2. He thanked the nuns from outside at the gate because again it's a cloistered convent, but Jackson knew the protocol and came, visited, and expressed his appreciation for their prayers. That sums up kind of, like I say, again, there's not much to tell about the city during the battle because it was down 5-7 miles as the crow flies from the city itself. I've mentioned it a lot. You'll love to take our Friends of the Cabildo French Quarter walking tours. Head out to friendsofthecabildo.org and you'll see the tour guide information right there on the homepage. If you want me to be your tour guide, got all my contact information. Ping me. I'll be happy to let you know when the next time I'm leading a walking tour, which is usually about twice a month. A very interesting resource. Now, I did this talk for the tour guide class, and then as I'm doing the research, I came across a resource that I was unfamiliar with at the time, and that was the Staff Ride Handbook from the Army Combat Studies Institute. The Army Combat Studies Institute is one of the educational units out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. My son, who is ironically a naval officer, got his master's degree in military history from the Army Command and General Staff College, which is the Combat Studies Institute is an adjunct of the Command and General Staff College out there at Leavenworth. They put together what are called staff rides. So let's say that you are an Army officer and you're doing research on various things. You can take a staff ride and go up through Baltimore and trace the War of 1812 up in that area. You can do that with a number of different things through conflicts and battles, starting in the beginning in the Revolution, all the way through the Civil War, down uh, into Pancho Villa and other conflicts after the Civil War. This handout, and it's on the show page for this podcast. A link to the PDF will be there, and you'll see that. You'll be able to download this. A lot of the maps in the presentation come from this staff ride resource because they're really simple, they're very clear, and that it's what you'd want if you're an Army officer and you've never been to New Orleans before, but you want to trace this back from an education standpoint. Of course, a word from your sponsor. Buy my books. Brothers of the Sacred Heart, New Orleans, is a story of my high school, Brother Martin High School, and its predecessors, St. Aloysius and Coriezu High Schools. My first book there in top middle, New Orleans, the Canal Streetcar Line, was the first history book I wrote for Arcadia Publishing. Maison Blanche Department Stores, Mr. Bingle is chapter 3. New Orleans Jazz, I was originally all set to write a book on Faubourg Treme, and the publisher came back and said, we'd like you to expand that. What do you think of writing a book on jazz? And it came out pretty good for a book that doesn't have sound, but it was pretty good. That's the 1967 incarnation of the Pres Hall Jazz Band on the cover. The olive green, the greenish colored book is not one of the Images of America books with sepia tone covers, but it is its title from Arcadia's legendary locals series. It's basically a who's who of about 180 people from the 300 plus year history of New Orleans. You can see Dutch, you can see Beauregard, Marie Laveau, you can see Wendell Pierce down there next to Mahalia Jackson in the other corner, late Dr. Francis, who just recently passed, on the other side. Kind of get the idea here. And then the sixth book, of course, is my book on, it's called Krause, the New Orleans Value Store, which is a history of Krause Department Store, which was at Basin and Canal Streets. The History Press approached me about that book because the MB book was quite successful. So all of them are available at the usual suspects. If you want one autographed, inscribed, that kind of thing, ping me. We can figure out something on that as well. Shout out to the folks who did this parchment, my favorite PowerPoint template. It's a Creative Commons PowerPoint template. I'll be happy to share with you if you like this and want to use it for yourself. In addition to doing the podcast and doing the blog and everything, I have a weekly newsletter that's called From the Streetcar. And if you go out to NOLAHistoryGuide.com, you'll see a link that says subscribe to our newsletter. And be happy to include you in that number and get a weekly, we do a feature article and some updates, add a vintage ad of the week, and then what I call the NOLA 6-word writing challenge as well. So feel free to subscribe. We'd love to have you. Of course, again, I am Edward Brandley. I am your NOLA history guy. NOLAHistoryGuide.com is the website. There's my email at edward@nolahistoryguide.com. And then I am NOLA History Guy on all the social medias. Thank you so much. I appreciate you listening to the pod. Again, I know this is a little bit on the overview side, I guess is the way to say it. Could be great deal, so much more detail as we go here. But we'll keep working on that as we go. Thanks again. And we'll talk to you soon.